Okay, so today we're talking about the second book in V.C. Andrews' Dollanganger series, Petals on the Wind. If you thought the first book was campy and ridiculous and over the top, then you are definitely in for a treat with this book in the series because it's probably the most dramatic and overblown of all of them. And it's got some problems, but I definitely enjoyed it. Part 1, Summary. The second instalment of V.C. Andrews' Dollanganger series follows the three surviving children, Kathy, Chris and Carrie, as they flee from their grandmother's house. They are taken in by a kindly doctor named Paul Sheffield. Chris pursues his career as a doctor, Kathy her career as a ballet dancer, while Carrie is sent off to a boarding school. All three children are scarred by their pasts, and new dangers wait for them. Due to being starved as a young girl, Kathy's puberty is stunted, and she is bullied by the girls at her school, and feels neglected by her brother and sister. Chris is still passionately in love with his sister Kathy, who pushes him away. Kathy falls in love with a number of men throughout the story, a violent ballet dancer called Julian, Paul Sheffield himself, and her mother's new husband, Bart. Petals on the Wind focuses on Kathy and her drive for vengeance against her mother, which culminates in a confrontation between them back at grandmother's house. Part 2. Campy revenge at its finest. So Petals on the Wind is overblown and ridiculous for all kinds of reasons, but I wanted to focus in this section specifically on Kathy and her ridiculous revenge plot in this story. Kathy's revenge is undoubtedly the driving force of the whole story. You pretty much can't get through a page without listening to Kathy thinking about how much she hates her mother, how much she needs to get her own back, and how much she's wronged them and all this stuff. And while obviously that makes perfect sense, Kathy is a young woman who's been through some terrible things in her life, and you're probably not just going to be able to let that go overnight. Nevertheless, the extent of her rage is just so over the top in terms of the way it's presented by Andrews that sometimes it's borderline funny to read. It also casts a darker light on Kathy's character. In the first book, she does have a kind of whiny, annoying quality to her, but again it's somewhat understandable, and she does have a certain innocence, and she's certainly got a moral compass. She's just frustrated by the situation, and unlike Chris, who makes excuses for their mother, she's less inclined to do that, which is fair enough. But in this book, she really becomes hardened as a person, and she's so hell-bent on revenge that she just stops caring about the people around her. She neglects Carrie and doesn't pay attention to her as much with her things that are going on with being bullied. She rejects Chris and doesn't really care about what he's going through. And of course, she goes through this string of men as well. And again, she doesn't seem to always care that much about what she's doing, who she might be hurting with her actions. If it gets revenge, if it gets her one step closer to revenge with her mum, then that's a-okay as far as she's concerned. And again, that is somewhat understandable. If you've been through the kind of things that Kathy's been through, you're going to be obsessed, you're going to be a bit dark. And actually, I kind of enjoy rooting for Kathy in this way. It's quite an entertaining protagonist to follow when they're just so angry and aggressive all the time in that way. So I actually quite enjoy Kathy's character in this book, although I have seen in other reviews people find Kathy just a little bit too much and a little bit over the top. But I think it works really well for the story that's being told here. It's very much a story of this girl getting revenge on the woman who wronged her. So I think it's done pretty well, and of course it's a little bit melodramatic, but that's what we like V.C. Andrews for. Part 3. The Many Lovers of Kathy Dollanganger. So one thing you're going to notice in this book is that Kathy seems to be the most beautiful woman that has ever walked the face of the earth, and that men will just fall down on their knees begging to sleep with her throughout the story because she's so beautiful and charismatic, which is hilarious given how, inside she's crazy and angry all the time, but, she's just so hot that everyone wants to be with her. And again, it borders on the ridiculousness. Almost every single male character in the book that is over the age of 18 falls in love with Kathy at some point, and usually this doesn't go very well for them. That being said, I do think that there is a point that V.C. Andrews is making here, which makes sense given the story. If you remember in my review of the first book, I said that it kind of feels like a gothic fairy tale with the mother playing the role of kind of wicked stepmother, but it's actually the birth mother, and Kathy being a sort of Snow White figure. I think that comparison is even more present in this story as well. One of the big things or themes in the story is Kathy thinking that she is almost like her mother. She's becoming her mother, and she's terrified of this because she doesn't want that to happen. And you do see this happening. As Kathy progresses in her career as a ballet dancer, she becomes more and more attractive and beautiful, and she kind of peaks in her kind of feminine glory, if you like, while the mother is growing old and faded, and she has to get plastic surgery to to keep her face looking firm. And it's almost like a witch, putting her potions on her face to preserve her youth, and obviously being very jealous of her daughter. So I think the point about Kathy just being so attractive is just meant to really make that theme, really bring that theme out. And it borders on the ridiculousness, but I do kind of see the Dollanganger series as being a kind of fairy tale. Even though it's not a supernatural story by any means, it does have that feel of the supernatural. It's not a gritty realist story by any stretch. It's got a certain magical realism style to it. And turning to the lovers themselves, should come as no surprise, all of them are more than a little bit creepy or disturbed. I think every single one of them assaults Kathy in some way during their relationship. Obviously Chris did that in the first book. He's kind of calmed down now in the second book. But all of them are not very good men. I mean, I don't think Paul does anything violent towards Kathy, but he is a father figure to Kathy, and then then obviously wants to marry her, which is kind of a bit disturbing given the paternal role, and then it becomes this. So none of the love interests are the kind of stand-up guys that you'd want to be in a relationship with, but Kathy, true to her character, she's not going to be very good at picking good men, and partly this is because she is driven by revenge, which is why obviously she goes after her mother's husband as well at one point in the story. I do think though that of all of these romances, the weirdest one is definitely between Paul Sheffield and Kathy, partly because I think it was somewhat unnecessary. It doesn't really add much to the plot to have this in, and actually when I watched the adaptation of the series, they actually cut that whole Paul Sheffield plot. The story begins at his funeral, and we go from there. So we never even meet the character, which I actually think was a good call, because to be honest, it's something that happens and it just seems to get in the way of the plot in an annoying way, and it doesn't really add much either to Kathy's character, to the overarching narrative that's being told. It's just another element of weirdness to the story that I don't think we really needed. Perhaps it's a way of creating some tension between Chris and Kathy and Paul, but then you can do that with characters like Julian and Bart. So you don't really need this other lover to create tension there between Kathy and Chris, because she's already got plenty of other options. So that was probably part of the story that I didn't really enjoy, mainly because I didn't think it was necessary. Also, one thing that I will say about Paul is I do find it funny because at one point in the story he realises what's been going on between Chris and Kathy, and he's mortified, and it's like, well, fair enough, that's probably more disgusting than what you're doing, but what you're doing with Kathy is hardly above board, so maybe look at yourself a little bit there. Part 3, timeline and structure. I think that V.C. Andrews kind of goes a bit over the top in this book with the timeline and the structure. What I liked about Flowers in the Attic is that as a book, it's very much self-contained in one place. Of course, it goes over a number of years because they're there, I think, for maybe 3 years altogether, but it's got the constraints of the house, which helps with this kind of gothic, foreboding sense of these children trapped in the attic. Whereas with this book, it kind of stretches from the moment they leave the house all the way until they're young adults. So you've got a massive stretch of time, and you have to get a lot into that. And I just feel like it might have been better to have constrained that time a little bit to focus on a specific part of their development, rather than going all this way. It also creates a lot of bloat in the early part of the story when we have Kathy and everyone meeting Paul Sheffield and then becoming acquainted with him in his house and all that kind of stuff. And like I said before, the adaptation did a good job in constraining this. Overall, I just think there's too much going on in this story. You have them growing up from being quite young to being young adults. You have so many lovers that it's absurd. You have Kathy's ballet, you have her revenge, you have the relationships with each man individually. There's just so much going on in this story in comparison to Flowers in the Attic, which is reasonably self-contained, that sometimes it's just a bit of an exhausting read and hard to keep track of what is going on because there's just too much. It feels like V.C. Andrews just kind of went crazy with this book and wanted to have as much ridiculous things in it as possible. And it would have been, I think, a better book if it had been a little bit more structured, a little bit more focused on, fewer lovers, and maybe more on Kathy, Chris, and Carrie, rather than all this other stuff. Part 4. How convenient. Andrews relies way too much on coincidences in this book. First of all, the meeting of Paul Sheffield is just such a coincidence. The children are, I believe, on a train where they meet Paul Sheffield's housekeeper, who then takes them to Paul, who then just happens to be nice enough to offer them somewhere to stay, and then we kind of go from there. He's also reasonably well off, and he's willing to invest money into Kathy's ballet career, although I suppose he fancies her, so maybe that does make sense. But also Chris sending him off to medical school and Carrie to a boarding school. It's just all very convenient that they would happen to find a wealthy doctor who would be willing to do all of this stuff for them. Likewise, the deaths in this story are even more ridiculously convenient. Basically, whenever Andrews needs to get rid of a character, there'll be a very dramatic death scene. There'll be a car crash or a fire or an explosion, and the character is just dead and it's shocking. And then she can just carry on with the story without this person there anymore. And to some extent, that is a little bit lazy, because a lot of these deaths have no connection to the characters and their decisions that they make. It really is like she creates, say Julian for example, he is there as a character to create tension between Kathy and Chris, and also Paul because he fancies her too, and also create some drama around her career as a ballet dancer because he's her ballet partner. But then when the story no longer needs that particular obstacle, we just kill Julian off because that's just more convenient. Likewise with Paul at the end, towards the end of the story, probably my favourite bit of the story in terms of silly deaths, his housekeeper has a heart attack and dies, and he is so shocked by the heart attack that he has a stroke, but he doesn't die because Andrews doesn't want to let Chris and Kathy get together right away, so then he's basically an invalid and Kathy is with him until he eventually croaks it. And then finally, after all of the other men in the story have been eliminated by ridiculous death scenes, Chris finally gets Kathy, which also casts doubt on Kathy as Chris's one true love. Did she just choose him because she's killed all her other well, she hasn't killed them, but because all her other options have gone and now she's with this one? It's just not the best way of telling a story, and it would have been a little bit better to either not have these characters just die when it was convenient, or if you want to kill them, sure, but make sure that their deaths make sense for the characters. They have to be connected to the actual person and the kinds of decisions that they would make, rather than just shock twist, there's an explosion, shock twist, there's a car crash, and so on. So I do think that element of the story, while I enjoy it because it's campy and over the top, very soap opera, it's not the best writing in the world. Part 5. Carrie and Chris. So I'd like to spotlight the other two Dollanganger children, Chris and Carrie, because although they don't get a lot of time in this book, they do have little subplots. I especially enjoy Carrie's subplot, and I actually wish we'd got more of it. In the story, like I said earlier, Carrie is struggling with the fact that because of her malnourishment, she is basically stunted. She is like a little sort of dwarfish character. She's not developing, she's not becoming a woman, and she has to struggle with this. And obviously, when she goes to school, everyone's bullying her, and her brother and sister are off doing their own thing, so she's not getting any support from them either. And this ends up in one of the more tragic deaths in the story, which does make sense given what Carrie goes through, and it's quite actually affecting part of the story. I really enjoyed this kind of plot with Carrie. I thought it was really well executed, it made sense to the character, and I do wish we'd got a little bit more of it, but then at the same time, it makes sense in a way that Carrie's story is very much a subplot that's in the background, because it feels to me that in this story the dominating force, as I've said, is Kathy's revenge, and she's so caught up in her need for revenge that she just doesn't really think about Carrie as much as she should. And so you do get this sort of overlooking of Carrie until, unfortunately, it's too late, and then we get the focus when it is too late. So I think that although I wish there was more of Carrie, because I think she's one of the more interesting characters in the story, it made sense given what V.C. Andrews was going for in the book. On the other hand, I do feel like Chris was given very, shortchanged quite a lot in this book. In Flowers in the Attic, I think he's a very interesting character. In some ways, maybe even more interesting than Cathy. And the reason that I think that is because he sort of has this sort of, you know, father bear type character. He's quite charismatic, he's clever, he's smart, he looks after them, but then he also has his dark side with what happens with Cathy in the first book. And he also has this complex relationship with his mother where he loves his mother just like Cathy loved their father, to the point where he idolizes her and he can't see that she's doing these terrible things, and Cathy really has to make him see. And I really like that kind of scenario, that kind of conflict in his character made him very interesting. And in this book, it would have been interesting to have explored the repercussions of all of that on him, because we kind of knew that Cathy would be full of revenge. It's kind of obvious from her character in the previous book, just how she is. But Chris, you know, what's he dealing with here? Because that is a much harder pill to swallow when someone who you've trusted and defended for 3 years has betrayed you, and you know you've lost your brother because of this, and by the end of this story, one of your sisters. How do you deal with that? But we don't get much focus on Chris, which is a shame. Also, it would be interesting to focus on how he feels about what he did to Cathy, because one of the kind of arguably big pitfalls of the story is that is never really addressed by Chris or Cathy. They don't really talk about it all that much. And you would think that that would be something that they'd need to address properly in order to deal with their relationship. One thing that, again, I think the adaptation did really well was that it actually gave Chris something to do in this story. It gave him a love interest, and then it was Cathy who had to deal with the fact that he seemed to be going somewhere else, knowing that he still very much loved her. And I think that that added an element to his character, which is just lacking in the books. Unfortunately, Chris in this book, and really for the rest of the series, but especially this book, just becomes a bit of a wet drip. He's just constantly mooning over Cathy like every other man in the world, wanting her, begging her to be with him, and there's not much else going on. And that is a shame because, like I say, I do think that the story itself is best when it focuses on the experiences of these broken children. And so just focusing on Cathy in this book, I do think that let it down a little bit. Although she is, you know, the focus, she's the narrator. With Flowers in the Attic, you just got a bit more of a sense of these siblings and how they were together. In this book, they're split apart, and that makes sense. But it would just be nice to get a bit more of Chris's journey. Obviously, you're constrained though, because it's told through Cathy's perspective, and they're just not together as much in this book. So there's not much that Andrews could have done, I suppose, but it's just something that I think would have been quite interesting to explore. Part 6, Conclusion. So overall, Petals of the Wind is definitely an uneven follow-up to Flowers in the Attic. To be honest, it surprises me in a way that this series is even a series, because although the ending of the Flowers in the Attic could be seen as a bit anticlimactic, with them just walking out and not having the confrontation with the mother, it could just end like that. That wouldn't necessarily, that open-endedness wouldn't necessarily bother me, but it's nice to have the confrontation at the end of this story. That being said, I do think that it's a ridiculously overblown novel. The melodrama is over the top. It's much more soap opera than gothic melodrama, and I definitely prefer the more gothic thing, because that's just that's my thing. But I still enjoyed it as a book. I think it's a good read. If you enjoyed the first book, I don't think you will hate this book. But as a whole, thinking about the series, I don't know if it's my favourite of them. I don't think it's the worst, I don't think it's the best, I'd put it somewhere in the middle. But it's certainly an entertaining read. If you enjoy tales of revenge and you want to see Cathy going through that, you'll definitely enjoy this book. I certainly enjoyed it. Some people find it grating, but I think it's quite funny. But yeah, I think the key with V.C. Andrews is just think of it as something to entertain you. That's what it's for. And if you like that campy, fun, over-the-top style, you'll enjoy this book as much as you enjoyed the first one. Alright, that's everything that I have to say about Petals on the Wind. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, and let me know in the comments, what do you think of the Dollanganger series? What do you think of this book? How would you rank it with respect to the other books in the series? Otherwise, take care everyone, I'll see you all in the next video. Ta-ra!